I think it's probably the latter rather than the former. There's no doubt that people are surviving now. The drugs that we have available are extremely effective, and one thing we know is that if you have HIV and you're on treatment and you're virologically suppressed, which means you don't have the virus in your bloodstream, you're not going to transmit to your partner. And you're not going to, if it's a pregnant mother, the pregnant mother will not transmit to her child. So that's probably one of the biggest drivers in terms of the drop in the number of new infections. In addition to this, of course, there are new prevention measures that have come through. So, for instance, people who are at very high risk of picking up HIV can actually take the same HIV drugs that are taken for treatment, and it will stop them from getting an infection, what we call pre-exposure prophylaxis. And even in the event that they do get exposed to HIV, there's the option of them taking the same drugs for 4 weeks to abort any infection. So things have moved on. Science is moving on. There's no doubt the numbers are declining in terms of new infections, and that's not because we are testing fewer. Because over the years, in the last 15 years, for instance, we've opened a lot of HIV treatment facilities across the country. A lot of money has been spent on the HIV program together with our partners. So I think what we're seeing is a true decline, and hopefully that decline will continue.
Right, but let's look at it from another point of view. And first, you find that HIV, the terms HIV and AIDS are sometimes used intermittently. So can we distinguish HIV? Is it all the same as AIDS? Can you just say HIV, AIDS, or, let's distinguish.
So that's a good question, Cyril, and I think it's important for people to realize the difference. Essentially, when we say HIV, it's the virus, the human immunodeficiency virus. So it's just like saying the malaria parasite.
Right.
Okay? AIDS is the condition that arises following infection with HIV. AIDS is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. In other words, your immune system has deteriorated as a result of the HIV infection. The virus itself attacks a part of the immune system called the white cells, particularly the CD4, the T cells that are responsible for protecting us. So once your immune system drops to a certain level, you are more prone to infections. That's when you develop AIDS. So the beginning is HIV infection, and then over the years, the decline in terms of the number of white cells you have dropping precipitously over a period of time will reach a stage where you are then vulnerable to infections such as tuberculosis, such as fungal meningitis, and that's defined as the AIDS stage. So all HIV treatment, the goal of HIV treatment is to stop people from reaching that stage of AIDS. Because once you reach that stage of AIDS, it's a lot more difficult to treat, and more or less for a lot of people, you've really run out of time because you don't have time for the drugs to kick in and work very well.
Well, you said numbers of infections, the numbers are down, but sadly more people are dying. So
more people have died than currently are surviving with HIV. But over time, that's going to change because more people are now living with HIV, and they are living very productive lives. They are able to look after their families. They are able to go out and seek food, etc., simply because the drugs are so effective. So over time, what we're going to have is new infections declining and more people having HIV being alive. And therefore, the burden of HIV would increase in the country because you're going to have more people living with HIV. But the good thing is that if we continue to have an effective program, the bulk of those living with HIV will not be infectious. So they will not be transmitting the infection to the rest of the public.
Now let's look at data with regards to Nigeria. What's wrong with data collected over the years in terms of infection, those who've died of AIDS, and the more vulnerable areas in the country?
So what we've been having in the past is we've been having surveys that they've been done in a good way. I'm not saying that those surveys were bad surveys, but it's just that we never really invested in carrying out a really robust survey the way that we have done now. The Nigeria AIDS Indicator and Impact Survey was launched by President Buhari back in June. It's possibly the largest single country HIV-specific survey ever done in the world. It was done with the help of our partners, the US government and Global Fund. They invested 91 million US dollars to do this. We practically went to every local government in the country. Our staff even went to areas that would be considered inaccessible. But the beauty of this particular survey is that it is so robust that the confidence interval for the results that we will get are so tight that I can tell you with certainty that the prevalence of HIV in Nigeria in a few days' time will be reliable. And to me, really, it's what we have done is we have recalibrated the HIV epidemic in Nigeria. Before, we had data that we could work on, but we knew that it wasn't the best data available because it had to be done based on the resources we had at the time, based on the technology, etc. But things have moved on. We now have a survey that was done that was methodologically sound, scientifically robust, and where we used technology right in the field, because we had real-time access to the data. As people were being tested, we could see it clearly, even in Abuja, as the numbers were coming up. And we knew what we were dealing with. So, in a way, it's the beginning of a new dawn for the HIV epidemic. India did something very similar, although it was a different sort of survey, and they were able to recalibrate and have a better idea of their data. The survey that we've done is a population-based household survey. Nigeria is the 13th country to have that done. And for other African countries, they've been able to use the data to strategize and move forward. And that's what we intend to do once we release the data in a few days' time.
In conducting the survey, how did you surmount the challenges of, definitely in this part of the world, people are resistant to surveys of this nature. So how do you get through being certain that what they're giving out is reliable? I mean, they've had challenges of a population survey, even with census figures, where people are not likely to give accurate data.
You'll be surprised what you get if people are well informed. The difference with this survey is we did a lot of work before we even launched the survey. There was a lot of publicity. We also did a pre-run where we initially did some trials across the country to find out what the problems were. The people that did the survey, the staff that we engaged, most of them were very literate. They were very well motivated, and we chose them from across the country, but mostly based on where they live. So the acceptance was much, much higher. In addition to that, what was really very pleasing to me was the fact that Nigeria continues to have a lot of capacity. We sometimes do not realize the sort of skills that our countrymen have. These guys really put their lives at risk for the purpose of the survey. We went into areas that were considered inaccessible because of security concerns, etc. We had people that were almost drowned. We had people that were almost kidnapped. But nevertheless, they put in their best. And the support we had from the state governments, from the traditional rulers, the religious institutions was great, because people realized why we needed this data. Without this data, we cannot plan for the future. At the moment, we have about 1 million Nigerians on HIV treatment, 95% of them being paid for by foreign entities. For Nigeria to be able, as a government, for us to be able to take over what is left, we need to know clearly what the gap is. And that was why we pushed for this survey. And I'm very pleased to say that the results we have, I can hand on heart say that they are accurate and they are internationally acceptable. They've faced all the rigors that any scientific activity can have. And we should be able to plan and argue with state governments to put in more resources and tell them where the problems are.
Surveys like these rely heavily on confidentiality. How were you able to assure those who took part in these of that aspect of it? I mean, because not everyone would want to advertise the fact. And there's quite a number of people who are living in denial.
Absolutely. So you're quite right. But even though it was a survey, but it's actually research. And with research, what you have is you have to have ethical. It has to go through a process of ethical approval. So we put it through the National Research Ethics Council. We got NREC approval. Our partners were able to get approval from the CDC in the US as well. There were clear-cut guidelines in terms of how our staff should engage with the public, how they should counsel people before testing them for HIV. It was done in such a way that people had privacy when we were doing the counseling as well as when we are taking bloods. But more importantly, I think when we test somebody and that person is positive, we make sure we link them up with treatment. So not only have we established a new baseline for HIV, but we've also been able to identify people who in the past maybe would never have gone to a hospital until it's very late, and we're able to link them up. The linkage to treatment has been the best we've ever seen compared to other programs that we've run. And we're trying to learn from that to find out, well, what did we do different that we can apply to the usual programs to make sure that people who are positive for HIV are accessing care and continue to take their drugs.
Well, while not preempting the release of this research and survey, which you say will be soon, what trends did you see? On a general note, I'm not asking for the specifics.
On a general note, obviously, right. Hopefully, Mr. President will be releasing the results in a few days, and we hope that the results will come to the country as something very exciting. It will be different to the results we've had in the past. It will enable us argue more forcefully for resources, particularly from the public sector in Nigeria, particularly the state governments, which I strongly believe need to be engaged more closely, as well as the private sector. But overall, the results will be very different to what we have given out in the past. And we can defend that, because if you're testing, we tested 220,000 people. In the past, the largest surveys we've had for HIV have been only about 30-something thousand. So you cannot compare the robustness and the size of the sampling, the nature of the sampling compared to what we've had before. But I'm sure, Cyril, you'll be able to wait for another few more days to get the details of the results. Beyond that, I'm afraid I cannot let the cat out of the bag.
All right. Actually, what I was looking out for was, say, for instance, and I'm not, saying this with reference to any particular part of the country. Say, for instance, the results of the survey show that in one area there is a higher prevalence than another. Would that translate to more attention or more resources being committed to those areas? In other words, would you now have specific areas arising from those results? Would you now have specific areas where you would need to intensify efforts?
Yes. So, first of all, let me say that the results of the survey are not going to show that everybody living with HIV in Nigeria has been diagnosed and put on treatment.
Right.
So, we're not going to lift our feet off the pedal. And certainly our partners have also given us that assurance they will not do so. But with HIV programs, they are expensive programs. When you test for HIV, you're spending money on test kits, etc. It makes more sense from a cost-effective side to be able to test maybe a few hundred and get a positive than to test 10,000 and get one positive. The survey will show us where we need to concentrate when it comes to getting those positives. It will also show us how well the programs have been running in certain parts of the country. So, for instance, it will give us a level of what we call virological suppression, population level virological suppression. I'm sure you've heard of the 90-90-90, where the target is you have 90% of all people within a population knowing their status, and 90% of them being on treatment, and 90% being virologically suppressed. So if you look at that 90-90-90, essentially what it is saying is at the end, what you want is 72% of the entire, 73% of the entire population having undetectable viral load. And if you have that situation, the epidemic dies out progressively. So we will be able to say the impact of the HIV program and what that gap is between what we have as a country and that 73%, and how we can fund that gap to make sure that we reach everybody that needs to be reached. Yes, so we will be prioritizing what we call high prevalence states, but that doesn't mean we're going to pull out of the low prevalence. No, it means the low prevalence would have a different sort of strategy, and that strategy has to do with closing the tap, prevention, making sure that the prevalence continues to be low, increasing awareness in those areas, making sure that those that are HIV-free continue to be HIV-free, whether they are adults or babies born to pregnant mothers.
All right, let's speak about costs, and you admit that it's expensive, and it's said that as much as 90% of the treatment currently available has been funded by foreign partners. But over the years, there has been a decline in the funding available for this. Has that not affected the program?
So, quite right, there has been a decline, progressive decline, but that's what you expect. In any donor program, Cyril, there's no donor program that's open-ended that will continue forever. And as a country and as government, we are very much aware of it, which was why we pushed for the survey to be done. President Buhari has actually really supported the national program we have in Taraba and Abia. So this year, for instance, he made sure that the gap we've always had in our budget has been accommodated for. And he's also made sure that going into the future, every patient we have on treatment under the government program is adequately catered for. But what the data will show, what the survey will show, is that we may have this number on treatment, and this is the burden. I'm not going to give you examples because people might misinterpret it, but we have about 1 million people now on treatment. So what's the gap? Do we have another 1 million that we need to treat? Or is it 2 million? Or is it 3 million? Once we know that, as government, we can then go back, look at our budgets, and also look at the state government health budgets. We know that if the government takes over the 1 million people on treatment now, I will be consuming more than 60% of the entire Federal Ministry of Health capital budget on it. So you can't do that for a single disease condition. But what we can do is to push for the programs to be more cost effective, to bring down the cost. And how can we bring down the cost? We can bring down the cost by making sure that testing is more targeted, by making sure that the drugs we buy them at a more competitive price, and if possible, having national procurement for these medications, making sure that our local industry as well can pitch in and start manufacturing antiretrovirals. And in addition to that, getting the private sector. We're just about to launch a HIV trust fund, hopefully in the next month or two. And that trust fund will be owned by the private sector. It will be driven by the private sector and will help us to get commodities brought into the country for that purpose. So yes, there is a long-term strategy to try and sort out this issue, but it's certainly not acceptable that as a country we are relying so much on foreign aid in order to keep our citizens, 1 million plus, alive and well.
Is there a buffer? Because yes, the data, the survey will bring out what you need to in terms of planning to take over treatment. Is there a buffer zone? Because I'm worried about the transition period from when you begin to take over these 1 million plus people.
So far, our friends haven't said we're making a runner. Not yet, anyway.
Right.
So from the survey, we know that the work is only just starting. What we've done is we've recalibrated. So we're only just about to start doing the work proper. But what we intend to do is to identify additional resourcing and also to negotiate properly to make sure that our programs not only achieve wider coverage, but are also more cost efficient. I really think that's, in the long term, that's what will sort out the HIV issue in the country. If we can bring down the cost per unit of looking after people living with HIV, whether it's from the facility side, because at the moment a lot of our patients go to teaching hospitals, etc., facilities that are very expensive. We need to start pushing towards primary health care. We need to integrate HIV into the maternal and child health programs, because it's not acceptable for pregnant women to come to an antenatal clinic and everybody's talking about HIV, but you're not talking about all the other things, the full blood count, the malaria film, etc. So have a bundle sort of approach, and also try and get the within the health facilities, the staff themselves can be trained. You don't need doctors to look after people living with HIV. There's no reason why you cannot train nurses, for instance, or other healthcare workers to deliver the treatment. And then in addition to that, also what we're trying to diversify in a way. So, for instance, if you have HIV, you don't need to be going to your facility every month for a medication. You should be able to get 6 months worth of medication. You should be able to get your medications from your local chemist for free. We can deliver them rather than you going and spending a whole day at a facility. So all these things will bring down the cost. At the moment, the cost is about 50 to 60,000 naira per year per patient to keep somebody on treatment. But if we can continue to push that cost down, government should be able to take up the additional responsibility.
How easy is access to this treatment for those who are already on it? Because for some time there have been issues of accessibility.
Actually, access, I don't think access is a major problem, Cyril. Yes, I know there are issues with some facilities charging for hospital cards, for instance, charging for blood tests that we have already paid for, like CD4 count and HIV viral load. And we're working on those facilities, and I'm sure very soon we're going to start taking a really, really hard look at this, and we will ask facilities to explain why. But overall, if you have HIV today, and I'm not saying you should have HIV, by the way, Cyril, but if you do get HIV today, you should be able to access a facility same day or within a few days and be put on treatment. We have enough facilities to accommodate that within the country.
All right, we're here with Dr. Sani Aliyu, Director General of NACA. Stay with us. We'll be back shortly.
Great, 4G is better. You don't know what you're missing till you experience it. Upgrade to a 4G device and SIM, SMS GET to 141 to enjoy double data on Nigeria's widest 4G network.
Airtel, the smartphone network.
Right. We're here with Dr. Sani Aliyu, Director General of the National Agency for the Control of AIDS, NACA. Dr. Lee, in the past, some would say a long time ago, you had in hospital facilities specific areas for infectious diseases. And I recall then that they would all be labeled isolation wards. And that led to a lot of stigmatization. I recall for people who had TB then, they were screened away from the main entrances of facilities like that. How have you been able to surmount that, given that the question of HIV and AIDS generated a lot of stigmatization?
So yes, HIV/AIDS continues to elicit a lot of fear in the public, but really, HIV is not that infectious. There are a lot more infections that one is more likely to get. So, for instance, tuberculosis is a lot more infectious. Hepatitis B is a lot more infectious than HIV. So, what we have realized is a lot of the stigma and discrimination has to do particularly with the fear of seeing people who are very sick, people who had AIDS in the past, where they are wasted, have fungal infections, etc. And people just go, gosh, I don't want to catch this. But the public need to be aware that you're not going to catch HIV by shaking somebody's hand or by kissing him or from razor blades, etc. It's very unlikely. The virus does not survive long outside the environment. You're far more likely to get other bloodborne viral infections. Over time, what we have been doing is to try and reduce this issue of stigma by improving awareness, but also by changing the structure of our programs. So, for instance, if you go to some of our facilities, Sileja, just nearby here, for instance, the clinics, we're now starting to integrate the HIV clinics into the general medical clinics. So a doctor would see somebody with diabetes, and then the next one will be a HIV person, and then the next one will be somebody with hypertension. So that takes out the stigma. We are progressively stopping having dedicated units for HIV. So, for instance, dedicated pharmacies, for instance, that is not necessary. Dedicated laboratory facilities, that's not necessary. Dedicated card registration areas, that's not necessary. And certainly for government to be able to take up the responsibility for people living with HIV, their treatment and their management, it needs to be integrated into mainstream healthcare. We cannot continue to have this division. A lot of the programs that we have, the intervention programs we call them, like HIV, are vertical structures. They do not feed into the normal health system. And as government, we know that it's not sustainable. It's more expensive. You need to have dedicated people running this, and it just doesn't work in the long term. So we are working towards mainstreaming HIV, and certainly I can see in the next 5-10 years where somebody living with HIV would be seen in a normal clinic, would go for his drug in a normal pharmacy, and should go for his blood test in a normal way, just like everybody else.
Is there any form of program for health professionals who are involved in all of this so as to change the thinking? Because basically, in the health facilities, that's where people begin to feel a little bit uncomfortable about testing and things like that over the years. Is there a sustained program?
So with our partners and the Federal Ministry of Health, and particularly our partners, Global Fund and the U.S. government, we have trained a lot of healthcare workers on HIV, a lot. In fact, in my view, then there isn't a very strong need to have such dedicated counseling now, because HIV is gradually becoming part of mainstream healthcare. In my view, we should have, and we do have it in the policies, but it's all about implementation. When it comes to pregnancy, for instance, we don't need this situation where a pregnant woman will have to ask to have a HIV test. They should be offered a HIV test and have a HIV test unless they decline it. In other words, it should be an opt-out situation. Over time, we need to make sure that those that are most at risk of HIV have easy access to the facilities. So, for instance, female sex workers, for instance, need to be able to have regular HIV testing. Men who have sex with men need to have regular HIV testing. We are already looking at making it easier for HIV testing to be done. We are now having saliva tests that we are currently evaluating. We're also having blood tests that are very easy to use as self-tests. Just like we commercialized condom, if you remember, Cyril, some years back, it was difficult to get a condom. Right. If you want a condom, you have to go to a facility and you will be there all ashamed, etc., trying to get a condom. But now if you walk into any pharmacy, you can get condoms. So what we want is to commercialize HIV test kits so that we have recognized, validated test kits that are available both in the public and the private sector, so that people can go in at any point and say, I want a HIV test kit, a self-test kit, take it home, test it in the comfort of their homes, and know their status.
Speaking about testing on the kits, these are self-test kits you talk about. How reliable are these? And seeing that if they are, how widespread do you think they've been used? And because there are still some facilities, health facilities, particularly privately owned health facilities, where HIV testing is still very expensive.
So most of certainly the self-test kits that are in the public sector are brought in for free. Nobody should be charged for a HIV self-test kit in the public sector. If they are being charged, then that's criminal, because we provide ourselves and our partners provide these test kits for free. There are test kits that are in the private sector that some of the private facilities obtain, but to my knowledge, they're very small. Most of the test kits in the country are brought in by our partners or by ourselves as the federal government. There are test kits that sometimes you see in some chemists, and these test kits are not validated. They are made in other parts of the world, and they were brought in. Some of them don't even have proper certification. We have what we call WHO pre-qualification. All HIV test kits that should be used in the country must be WHO pre-qualified.
So people should be wary about just walking into a pharmacy or some store
absolutely.
And purchasing.
Yeah, purchasing. And definitely, there are test kits that we have not validated. It's very easy for people to check. You can check online and see what our current national testing algorithm suggests. But more importantly, why waste your money? Just go to a facility and we'll do it for free for you.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
Sometimes,
but sometimes,
the issue
of course,
the stigma is still,
definitely.
But
Even with the stigma, as we roll out self-test kits, these should be available for free in the facilities and should be available in the private sector at a reduced price.
Speaking about the stigma, in securing employment into government institutions and sometimes educational institutions, applicants are required to present a health certificate and to do some tests. It's been known. Well, I'd like to know if we've seen a decline in that. It's been known that some people on the presentation of their health certificates who have been discovered to have HIV had been denied either employment or admission into educational institutions. A number of such cases were reported in the media some years back. What's the situation like?
So as an agency, we are supporting anybody who's discriminated against in terms of employment, in terms of being able to access healthcare just because of their HIV status. Nobody should be tested for HIV without their consent. If they cannot consent, then it should be a medical decision whether it's in their best interest or not. Employers are not allowed to test for HIV. It's against the law. You should not test for HIV unless you have the consent of the person. There are certain professions where knowing the HIV status is important, but that's really the medical profession where you're a surgeon, for instance, you're doing what we call exposure-prone procedures. So that's important. But otherwise, it's not the employer's business to know that the employee has HIV or not. There are people that have HIV, millions in the world, that are on treatment and are probably healthier than you and I. What they have is a virus in their bloodstream and they're controlling the virus. They are not a risk to anybody. We see no reason why people should be forced to test for HIV by employers, and certainly if we have those situations, we will take up the fight on behalf. We already have lawyers that are currently standing in for people who have taken, in fact, we have a gentleman who's just won a court case and we're helping him to negotiate a settlement.
Well, Nigerians are said to be very religious people, and we know that certain religious organizations and certain faiths demand an HIV status certificate for intending couples. And sometimes you do find the results being flouted in the open. How does that go with that?
So really that is awareness. So again, I'll bring you back to the issue of virological suppression. If somebody has HIV and they are on medication and they are virologically suppressed, they are not going to transmit the virus to their partners. Before, we didn't have that situation because we didn't have HIV drugs available. So when it comes to knowing HIV status, yes, if you're getting married as a couple between yourselves, it's important that you know your status. But that shouldn't be a precondition. And it certainly shouldn't be forced upon the partners. It shouldn't be forced upon the partners. If one partner has HIV, the other one is negative, it shouldn't stop the marriage provided that partner is on treatment, virologically suppressed, and the negative partner is aware. Because it's voluntary. But why on earth would you want to stop a couple from getting married if they have HIV? Because at the moment, you're not testing for hepatitis B. Are we testing for Hep B? That's far more infectious. Are we testing for TB? Asking people, do they have a cough, weight loss, night sweats? We're not. Zero.
That part brings me to this Nigeria AIDS indicators and impact survey we talk about. Would it in any way provide some information or insight into the prevalence of hepatitis B, for instance?
Yes, we actually tested our clients for hepatitis B and hepatitis C. So we're going to have very robust data on hepatitis B and C. We're still analyzing that data, so that data will not be available in the next few days as Mr. President announces the results of the HIV survey. But it should be available in the coming months, and it should enable us to plan accordingly. Just like with HIV, there's treatment for Hep B, which you have to take for life as well. But hepatitis C, there's actually a cure. You take a set of drugs for some weeks, and you have a more than 90% chance of clearing the virus completely.
High-risk lifestyles and living in denial. I want to go to that area where, yes, over time, people have gradually come to accept that there is HIV and there's AIDS. It's real. But you do look around, and I'm saying this without moralizing. You do look around society and you still find certain behavioral patterns, which many might say, expose people to infections. What do you have to say about that?
So that's why it's important that while we talk about treatment, diagnosis, putting people on treatment so that they are no longer infectious, we also need to talk about prevention. And as they say, prevention is better than cure. Years back, you and I had a lot of exposure to information on HIV, on TV, on billboards, etc. We also saw people who were very sick, and you don't want to be that sick. So if you're told, okay, the way to survive and avoid getting into the same situation is you use protection and you're faithful to your partner, etc., a lot of people will do that. But nowadays, because HIV has become normalized, which is a good thing, because it means people are alive, they are well. If you see somebody living with HIV on the road, on treatment, you will not even know that they are on treatment. And that's why our young people now do not have the same sort of fear of catching HIV as our generations had. But that in itself is a fallacy, because if you catch HIV, the fact is you will need to be on treatment for life. You will continue to have the virus, not necessarily in your bloodstream, but within your body, so you're not going to clear it. And then you will still have issues when it comes to relationships, marriage, etc., because you still have to inform your partner. We are working, there's a lot of work going on, especially with the civil society and our partners, to concentrate on adolescent and young people, because this is where most of the risk is, really. They're the ones that take the risk. The older generation are far more risk averse than the younger generation. A lot of the new infections we are now getting, sadly, are in women between the ages of 15 to 24. And some of them get HIV before they've even heard of HIV. And because of exposure. No. So it's all about engagement and media strategies and enlightenment, etc.
Now, a lot of attention is paid to unprotected sex as one of the major forms of infection. But there are other ways people can get infected, and it would seem that over time the awareness on those other modes have been on the decline.
So, as I said earlier, HIV is actually not that infectious. So if you look at 90% of HIV infections will be from sexual contact.
Right.
At least 90%. They will be mostly sex between different genders or with the same gender, particularly men who have sex with men. In Nigeria, that's the majority. Injection drug use in Nigeria is not that common. So Injection drug use as a major driver of the HIV epidemic is less, but it's important for people to be aware of that.
Sharp tools?
Sharp tools.
Because we engage in all kinds of practices.
So blood transfusions, I will mention the key ones.
Right.
So the key ones really are sexual transmission, injection drug use, blood transfusions, contaminated blood, and mother to child.
Right.
Okay? Everything else is much lower risk. So if I have, I know if you go to your local barber, you would, they sterilize the instruments, they use fire, etc. That should kill any form of HIV, no matter how robust. In fact, with sharp instruments, etc., you're more likely to get hepatitis B. If you have a needle stick injury in the community, for instance, you're more likely to pick up hepatitis B. And that's why hepatitis B vaccination is crucial in any sort of public health intervention. It's more important for you, especially if you're a healthcare worker, to make sure that you're up to date with your hepatitis B. If you're a policeman or if you're somebody who works in the community rubbish bins, heap, etc., sort out your hepatitis B. You're far more likely to get Hep B than HIV.
Since we're speaking about practices in society, yes, in established salons, people sterilize equipment, but the worry here is about the millions in the rural areas and even in urban centers where you have local manicurists, local barbers, and you know, the ones you refer to in the north as Masu Yankamparishi and Masu Kachia. We will use all kinds of implements. And
definitely.
What are the risks here?
So when it comes to circumcision, I would expect it to be a health facility, and even if it's not a health facility, if it's a traditional person, they should be aware of the risks. Awareness is what would help with this. People need to be aware when it comes to exchange of body fluids in whatever way, whether it's from an instrument or from person-to-person contact. That risk continues to be there. Having said that, with HIV, the moment you expose the virus externally and the blood dries up, it's very unlikely you would have viable viruses that would transmit. So any form of cleaning of the instrument will probably get rid of the virus itself.
With treatment, there are concerns, are there, about side effects? What are the new strategies in treatment? Because, well, at one point in time, it was said that not everyone who had HIV should be on antiretroviral drugs.
So things have changed, Cyril. The world has moved on. Nowadays, if one is picked up with HIV, you start treatment straight away. The drugs have become simplified. 15 years ago, 20 years when I started dealing with HIV, you had to take a cocktail of drugs, 6 tablets, 4 times a day, 20 tablets, etc. Now it's just 1 pill once a day. The drugs themselves are more, they are more tolerable. We are currently working with the U.S. government Angle Fund to change a lot of the drugs that we have been using in the past. We are introducing a new regimen called tenofovir, lamivudine, dolutegravir, which we have been using in the UK for some years now, the equivalent, and it's very tolerable. I've never had any patient coming back to me while on dolutegravir to say I can't take
the normal cocktails.
So it will be a cocktail, but everything is in 1 pill. So it's a cocktail of 3 drugs, but it's in 1 pill. So you take 1 tablet once a day. So it's not that onerous. The side effects are very minimal. Before, I agree, the HIV drugs we used, zidovudine, for instance, was causing anemia, stavudine, peripheral neuropathy, lipodystrophy, people wasting, having fat loss, etc. But all that's gone now. The main issue with the HIV drugs is a small proportion of people might develop kidney problems. And even then, we're now having drugs that will be coming through in the coming years that would sort out that kidney issue. The message I need to give out to people living with HIV that are currently on drugs is, please take your drugs. It will keep you alive. We have regimens that it should be possible for you to take with minimal side effects. But more importantly, remember, science is moving on. In the next 4 or 5 years, we hope to have injectables that would be used once every few months. So maybe once every 3 months, you go to a clinic, you'll have an injection, and you'll go away and you'll be able to live your normal life. And another 3 months later, you go back. You don't need to remember to take drugs. In 10, 20 years' time, who knows? There might be a cure.
Speaking about that, quite recently there were reports of some trials which had led to either a remediation or some,
So
person living with HIV/AIDS, and they're saying the viral load is completely gone. What does that spell? Perhaps new advances in a few years' time?
Science is progressing really fast, Cyril. I attended a meeting in the US where the whole strategy was about a HIV cure when it comes through. How do we roll it across Africa? Some years back, nobody was talking about a HIV cure. I am convinced that in the next 10, 20 years, we will have a solution to this scourge. The patients that have been mentioned in the press that have had a cure essentially have had a functional cure, which means that the cells that the HIV virus latches onto in order for it to proliferate, the receptor has been changed. But they all had that change as a result of bone marrow transplantation. Bone marrow transplant is not something that you would do lightly. You're more likely to die from a bone marrow transplantation than to die from HIV if you're taking your drugs. So these patients needed a bone marrow transplant because they had some other reason. Maybe they had a blood cancer, etc. In the process of getting a bone marrow transplant, you get bone marrow from a donor. So if that donor happens to have a mutation, a change in their receptors that makes them resistant to HIV, once you have that bone marrow transplant, you will acquire that resistance, and even if you had HIV will clear from your bloodstream. That's what those two patients had. But remember, you wouldn't do bone marrow transplant lightly. The side effects are huge. You could end up with graft versus host disease, blindness, kidney problems, skin problems, and you could die from the procedure. Bone marrow transplant the mortality can be as high as 10%.
In certain parts of Africa, there have been claims, and I call them claims and counterclaims, about advances in traditional approaches towards treatment, HIV, and even certain claims about so-called cure. What's your reaction to these claims? I mean, we do have such in Nigeria as well, where people claim that they're traditional herbal concoctions.
So with science, there's a way we follow a system in order to register a drug and to use a drug. And that system is robust. You have to do a clinical trial, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. You have to look at the efficiency of the drug. You have to try it in animals to make sure there's no side effects. Then you try it in humans. But even before you do that, you need to understand the mechanism of action of the drug. The HIV drugs that we have gone through that process, have been validated. And that's why, Cyril, if you have a headache, and I've said this before, if you have a headache, you want to go to a pharmacy and buy paracetamol. Why are you buying paracetamol with such confidence? It's because that paracetamol has gone through a rigorous process of validation. The persons currently claiming to have a cure, their drugs have not been subjected to those trials. They don't even know the true mechanism of action, if it works at all. They haven't gone through animal trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. And medicine is all science. It's all about science, really. I'm not saying that I'm completely dismissing them. What I'm saying is, if you really feel you have a cure, go through the proper process, validate it. It should be subject to the same rigor as any other medication before it can be given to humans. Drugs that are given to humans that have not been subjected to this, you are actually breaking the law, and you could be liable to prosecution.
All right. Dr. Ali, as we begin to wind down, let's put this out again for, the general public. HIV infection is not necessarily a death sentence.
No, it is not a death sentence. HIV is still very much with us. It's important that people know their status, because if you know your status, you're more likely to be alive in the coming years. The drugs are very effective. They are very much available. For pregnant women, it's even more important they know their status, because if they take the medications, they can protect their babies from getting an infection. But again, I would emphasize, know your status. If you have an issue If you're worried about getting a HIV test done, if you've been exposed to somebody with HIV, there are people out there. We do have a call center line, 6222. We are open Mondays to Fridays, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. If you give us a ring from anywhere within the country, we'll be able to tell you the closest facility you can go and have a HIV test done. And we will support you if you're HIV positive.
Right. For those who aspire to still live a normal life, even though they're infected with HIV, that's talking about couples who still want to have babies. It's quite possible now for a healthy HIV-free child to be born by HIV-positive parents.
Absolutely.
And perhaps to put that out to the public again.
Absolutely.
A way of reassurances.
Definitely, definitely. If you have HIV, persevere with your medications. Please continue to take your medications. Do not play around with them because you can end up with resistance. And if you end up with resistance, the alternatives are more toxic, they are more expensive, and they are less available. But at the same time, if you're pregnant, it is not the end of the world. We can stop your baby from getting HIV. Even if you're HIV and you're pregnant, there's no reason why. There are parts of the world that have eliminated mother-to-child transmission. In Nigeria, we are pulling all the brakes to make sure that we join that part of the world.
Finally, on the part of NACA, as we look ahead into the future, what role do you expect NACA to do beyond this?
So NACA will continue to play its coordinating role. We have a multi-sectoral responsibility, which means that we coordinate the HIV response across all the federal ministries and also across the state governments. My plea is really to the state governments. The federal government is putting resources into HIV, but remember, HIV is on the concurrent list. State governors need to help us with this. Please remember that we cannot have a situation where our countrymen are entirely dependent on foreign aid to be alive. We need to live up to our responsibilities. Federal government has done its bit. We will continue to push, but the state governments need to join us here.
And this Nigeria AIDS Indicators and Impact Survey will be released to the public very soon. Very soon.
Watch this space.
All right. While we are with the release of this survey, we'd like to thank you, Dr. Sani Aliyu, Director General, National Agency for the Control of AIDS, NACA. Thank you for coming on One on One.
It's a pleasure, Cyril.
Right. And that's our program today. We thank you for being part of it. Next week, we'll be back with One on One. I am Cyril Stober. Bye for now.
I am Adeola Omokibi, and the program you're watching is Sports Real. Keep a date with us.
Fans, they don't understand the rules or the laws of the game.
Hello and welcome to that program of yours on the NTA Sports Channel, Knowing Golf.